What kind of man defeats an empire without firing a single shot? No army, no weapons, no violence, just a fragile body, a quiet voice, and an idea powerful enough to shake the foundations of global power. History tells us that empires fall through war, blood, and conquest. Yet in the 20th century, one man seemed to break that rule entirely. Mahatma Gandhi stood barefoot before the British Empire, the most powerful political and military force on earth, and refused to fight on its terms. No riots, no revolutions fueled by rage, only discipline, self-sacrifice, and moral pressure. The question is not whether this worked. It clearly did. The real question is far more uncomfortable. Was this true strength, or was it a gamble that history happened to reward? Today, we are not here to praise Gandhi blindly, nor to diminish his moral stature. His ethical influence is unquestionable. Instead, we are doing something far more demanding. We are placing Gandhi on trial through the lens of Stoic philosophy, not as a saint, not as a symbol, but as a man measured against one of the most ruthless moral systems ever created. Stoicism does not care about intentions. It does not worship outcomes. It asks only one thing. Was the action rooted in reason, virtue, and inner sovereignty, or was it dependent on forces outside the self? Stoicism was forged in a brutal world. Its thinkers lived under emperors, tyrants, wars, plagues, and exile. They did not build philosophies for ideal conditions. They built systems meant to function when everything collapses, when comfort disappears, when justice fails, when power is abused. That is why Gandhi presents such a fascinating paradox. His discipline looks stoic. His calm mirrors the Stoic ideal. His courage rivals that of any ancient philosopher. Yet the engine driving his actions may not have been reason alone. And that is where the tension begins. This is the Stoic Lighthouse, a place where ancient wisdom cuts through modern confusion. Our goal is not comfort, but clarity. If that kind of clarity matters to you, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps this lighthouse reach more minds navigating chaos. In this analysis, we will dissect Gandhi's life through a Stoic framework, his radical self-control, his emotional resilience, his moral courage. And then we will confront the fractures, the reliance on love as a weapon, the dependence on political outcomes, the dangerous question of whether non-violence survives when the enemy has no conscience. By the end, we will deliver a Stoic verdict, not emotional, not sentimental, but honest. Number 1, radical self-mastery, temperance taken to the extreme. Gandhi's first and strongest line of defense in a Stoic court is not political, it is personal. Before he ever challenged an empire, he waged war against himself. In Stoicism, no man is fit to confront external power until he has mastered his own impulses. And on this battlefield, Gandhi was ruthless. His life became a living experiment in absolute self-control. While modern culture equates freedom with indulgence, Gandhi pursued the opposite path. He believed that every unchecked desire weakens the soul and hands power to the external world. For the Stoics, this principle is known as temperance, not moderation as comfort, but mastery as discipline. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, argued that a free man is one who is ruled by reason rather than appetite. Gandhi embodied this idea with radical consistency. His fasting was not symbolic theater. It was a deliberate act of will. Hunger, fear, pain, and discomfort were treated as tools, not enemies. Each fast was a declaration that the body does not command the mind. According to Musonius Rufus, philosophy is meaningless if it does not train the body alongside the soul. According to Musonius Rufus, the person who trains himself to endure hunger, thirst, heat, and cold strengthens his character and becomes better prepared for life. Gandhi lived this principle daily. He stripped his life of excess until nothing remained but what was essential. Simple clothing, minimal possessions, a hard floor instead of a bed. This was not poverty imposed by circumstance, it was voluntary discomfort. And for Stoics, voluntary discomfort is not self-punishment. It is liberation. Seneca famously advised practicing poverty in advance so fortune could never terrify you. Gandhi went further. He made simplicity permanent. In doing so, he removed fear at its root. Modern Stoic thinkers echo this same logic. William B. Irvine explains that when we willingly experience discomfort, we weaken the grip that fear and desire hold over us. According to William B. Irvine, by practicing discomfort voluntarily, we reduce our dependence on external conditions and expand our capacity for resilience. Perhaps the most controversial expression of Gandhi's temperance was his vow of celibacy. At a stage of life when most men cling tighter to pleasure, he renounced it entirely. This was not moral exhibitionism, it was strategic self-governance. Gandhi believed that unrestrained desire fragments attention and erodes moral focus. The Stoics would not disagree. Epictetus warned that when desire rules the mind, freedom disappears. According to Epictetus, no one is free who is not master of himself. This level of discipline granted Gandhi an authority that no title could provide. He could ask others to sacrifice because he had already sacrificed everything himself. He could endure prison because he had already conquered comfort. He could face an empire because he had already defeated his own cravings. From a Stoic perspective, this is not symbolic strength, it is the real thing, power that cannot be confiscated, authority that does not depend on status. In this domain, the verdict is clear. Gandhi did not merely resemble a Stoic, he lived one of its most demanding virtues with a consistency that few philosophers ever achieved. Number 2, the inner citadel. Why external power never touched Gandhi's mind. If self-mastery was Gandhi's foundation, inner resilience was his true stronghold. Few lives were subjected to external pressure with such consistency. He was beaten, imprisoned, publicly ridiculed, and surrounded by political chaos for decades. For most people, these conditions would create resentment or despair. Yet Gandhi moved through them with a composure that disarmed even his enemies. From a Stoic perspective, this was not temperament, it was training. Stoicism insists that adversity only becomes destructive when it breaches the inner life. The Stoics described the mind as a fortified city. Events may rage outside its walls, but the soul remains sovereign unless it surrenders control. Gandhi lived as if he had internalized this principle completely. Prison restricted his body, not his will. Insults attacked his image, not his character. Violence threatened his safety, not his moral direction. Epictetus built his philosophy on this precise distinction between events and judgment. Epictetus explained, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but the opinions we form about them." Gandhi treated imprisonment as a condition, not an injustice to be emotionally avenged. He read, reflected, and wrote while confined. He used isolation as refinement rather than punishment. By refusing to label hardship as an evil, he denied it the power to corrupt his inner state. This is a core Stoic maneuver. Reframe the event, and you reclaim sovereignty. Marcus Aurelius returned repeatedly to this same strategy in his private meditations. He reminded himself that external forces cannot invade the mind without consent. Marcus Aurelius reflected, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Gandhi embodied this insight in action. British authority could dominate territory, but it could not command his inner life. Public humiliation failed because he did not anchor his identity to reputation. Fear failed because he had already abandoned comfort. Even pain failed to provoke hatred because he refused to grant suffering moral authority. Modern Stoic thinkers describe this state as emotional independence. William B. Irvine emphasizes that tranquility is not emotional coldness, but disciplined clarity. William B. Irvine explains, "The goal is not to suppress emotion, but to prevent it from overriding reason." This helps explain Gandhi's calm during moments of extreme volatility. When riots erupted and political negotiations collapsed, he did not mirror the chaos around him. He absorbed it without surrendering clarity. His stillness became a form of resistance. By maintaining inner order, he exposed the disorder of power driven by fear and impulse. From a Stoic perspective, this level of mental sovereignty is rare. A person who does not depend on approval, comfort, or victory for inner stability becomes nearly impossible to manipulate. Gandhi's inner citadel did not collapse under pressure. It held, and because it held, everything else followed. Number 3. The force of truth, moral courage without violence. Courage is often misunderstood. In modern culture, it is confused with aggression, dominance, or the willingness to inflict harm. Stoicism rejects this definition entirely. For the Stoics, courage is not measured by what a person can destroy, but by what they are willing to endure without abandoning reason or virtue. This is where Gandhi's philosophy of action, known as satyagraha, demands serious attention from a Stoic perspective. Satyagraha means firmness in truth. It was not passive resistance, and Gandhi was explicit about that distinction. Passivity avoids conflict. Satyagraha confronts it directly, but without surrendering moral control. Gandhi believed that true strength reveals itself when a person refuses to compromise their principles even under pressure. Arrest, pain, public backlash, and personal loss were not deterrents. They were accepted costs. Stoic courage follows a similar logic. Courage is not recklessness. It is the steady commitment to act rightly, regardless of consequence. Chrysippus, one of the great systematizers of Stoic thought, argued that virtue must remain consistent across circumstances. A courageous action does not depend on safety or success. It depends on alignment with reason. Chrysippus taught, "A virtuous action remains virtuous, even when it brings suffering rather than reward." Gandhi's actions reflect this principle. He did not calibrate his resistance based on comfort or probability of success. He accepted imprisonment and violence as foreseeable outcomes, not tragedies. His courage was not emotional, it was deliberate. By refusing to retaliate, he forced power to expose itself without disguise. The empire could either restrain itself or reveal its brutality to the world. The Stoic tradition offers a parallel in the figure of Cato the Younger. Cato defied Julius Caesar not because he expected victory, but because surrender would violate his conception of justice. Gandhi followed a similar moral trajectory. He did not act because victory was guaranteed. He acted because compliance would corrupt his integrity. Marcus Aurelius expressed this idea with brutal clarity. Action rooted in virtue must remain independent of outcome. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do what nature demands, accept what follows." Gandhi's courage operated within this framework, but with a distinctive form. He absorbed violence without returning it. This required a level of psychological strength that few possess. It is far easier to strike back than to remain exposed. In this sense, satyagraha was not weakness, it was controlled endurance. This understanding of courage later influenced American history in a profound way. Martin Luther King Jr. adopted Gandhi's model during the civil rights movement, recognizing that nonviolent confrontation forces moral clarity. Violence confuses the narrative. Discipline sharpens it. Martin Luther King Jr. stated, "Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it." From a Stoic lens, Gandhi's courage deserves recognition. He faced injustice without surrendering to fear or rage. He accepted suffering without abandoning moral direction. In this domain, Gandhi does not fall short of Stoic standards. He fulfills them with a different instrument, but the same internal resolve. Courage, for the Stoics, is not about dominance. It is about remaining upright when pressure demands collapse. Gandhi stood firm, and in doing so, he redefined what strength could look like in the modern world. Number 4. Love as a weapon, where Gandhi breaks with Stoic reason. This is where the trial turns. Up to this point, Gandhi has stood comfortably within Stoic territory. Discipline, inner sovereignty, moral courage. But here, a fundamental fracture appears. The source of Gandhi's resistance was not reason alone. It was love, not metaphorical love, not rhetorical compassion. A deliberate, universal love directed even toward his oppressors. And from a strictly Stoic perspective, this is where agreement becomes tension. Gandhi's philosophy rested on ahimsa, the refusal to harm. But ahimsa was not merely strategic restraint, it was moral love in action. He believed that enduring suffering without retaliation could awaken the conscience of the aggressor. His goal was not to defeat the enemy, but to transform him. This is a crucial distinction. Gandhi did not seek victory through superior logic or force. He sought conversion through moral exposure. Stoicism approaches emotion very differently. The Stoics were deeply suspicious of emotions as drivers of action, even noble ones. They argued that emotions distort judgment and weaken consistency. The Stoic ideal is not emotional suppression, but emotional independence. Actions must arise from reason aligned with nature, not from passion, however well-intentioned. Chrysippus, who refined Stoic logic into a coherent system, argued that virtue must remain rationally grounded to remain stable. Chrysippus explained, "Every virtuous action must be guided by reason, not by impulse, even when the impulse appears noble." From this perspective, love becomes problematic. Love can fluctuate. Love can blind. Love can attach moral outcomes to emotional responses. Gandhi embraced this risk fully. He believed love was not a weakness to be eliminated, but a force to be disciplined and weaponized. His resistance depended on compassion as much as conviction. Seneca approached this issue with caution. While he defended mercy and benevolence, he warned against allowing emotional pity to guide decisions. For Seneca, justice required clarity, not sentiment. Seneca argued, "The wise person helps others from reasoned goodwill, not from emotional disturbance." This distinction matters. The Stoic helps because reason demands it. Gandhi resisted because love compelled it. The outward behavior may look similar: patience, restraint, forgiveness. But the internal engine is different. Stoicism seeks freedom from emotional dependence. Gandhi accepted emotional engagement as a moral necessity. Modern Stoic thinkers have echoed this concern. William B. Irvine emphasizes that emotional attachment, even to noble causes, can reintroduce vulnerability into the inner life. William B. Irvine notes, "When our peace depends on how others respond, we surrender control we worked so hard to reclaim." Gandhi's method required the oppressor to feel shame, to recognize injustice, to respond to moral pressure. This means his strategy depended on the emotional capacity of the enemy. Stoicism avoids this dependency. It demands moral autonomy regardless of the emotional state of others. This does not invalidate Gandhi's path, but it does separate it. His resistance flowed from the heart as much as the mind. Stoic resistance flows from reason even when the heart resists. Here, the two traditions no longer overlap. They diverge. In this chapter, the Stoic court does not condemn Gandhi, but it does draw a line. Love as a weapon can inspire transformation. Reason as a guide ensures independence. Gandhi chose the first. Stoicism insists on the second. Number 5. Virtue or outcome, when a moral life depends on political victory. At this stage of the trial, the question shifts from motivation to destination. Until now, Gandhi has been evaluated by how he lived. Here, he is judged by what he aimed to achieve. Stoicism draws a sharp line between acting virtuously and achieving a desired result. For a Stoic, this distinction is non-negotiable. Virtue is the goal. Everything else is secondary. Gandhi's life, however, was anchored to a concrete external objective: the independence of India. Every march, fast, arrest, and public sacrifice was strategically aligned toward this political outcome. His discipline served the cause. His suffering was leveraged to pressure power. His moral authority was deployed to change policy. This does not diminish his integrity, but it does raise a critical Stoic concern. Stoicism insists that external outcomes lie beyond our control. A wise person acts rightly regardless of whether the world responds favorably. The action itself is the victory. Epictetus warned that tying one's sense of fulfillment to external success invites inner instability. Epictetus cautioned, "If you desire things that are not within your control, you will necessarily be disappointed and disturbed." From a Stoic perspective, Gandhi's mission introduces risk. His peace of mind, at least partially, depended on whether the British Empire responded to moral pressure. When negotiations stalled, when violence erupted among his own people, when the partition of India descended into chaos, Gandhi experienced profound anguish. These moments reveal something important. His inner equilibrium was not entirely insulated from political outcomes. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that success and failure in the external world are morally indifferent. Marcus Aurelius reflected, "If you act rightly and things turn out badly, you have lost nothing." A Stoic sage could live under tyranny, fail publicly, or die unheard, and still consider life a philosophical success. The measure is internal coherence, not historical impact. Gandhi's life, by contrast, was inseparable from collective liberation. His virtue functioned not only as an end, but as a means. Modern Stoic commentators often highlight this tension. William B. Irvine explains that when virtue becomes a tool rather than the destination, tranquility becomes conditional. William B. Irvine explains, "When we pursue external goals, even noble ones, we risk allowing outcomes to dictate our emotional state." This does not imply that Stoicism rejects political engagement. Stoics believed in social duty. They served as senators, generals, and advisors, but they insisted on one safeguard: the outcome must never define the worth of the action. A Stoic fights injustice because justice demands it, not because victory is guaranteed. Gandhi's greatness lies in his willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause larger than himself, yet this is precisely where he departs from Stoic purity. His life was oriented toward changing the world, not merely mastering the self. When freedom arrives, the struggle is validated. When it falters, the pain cuts deeper. From a Stoic standpoint, this attachment introduces vulnerability. A noble vulnerability, but a vulnerability nonetheless. The court does not accuse Gandhi of weakness. It identifies a philosophical divergence. Gandhi sought liberation in history. Stoicism seeks liberation within. Number 6. The dangerous limit of nonviolence. Would Gandhi's method survive a real tyrant? This is the most uncomfortable moment of the trial, not because it diminishes Gandhi's moral stature, but because it forces a question that Stoicism refuses to avoid. Does a philosophy remain valid when the world becomes ruthless? Gandhi's method of nonviolence proved effective against the British Empire, but Stoicism demands something harsher. A philosophy must function not only in favorable conditions, but in the worst ones imaginable. Gandhi's strategy relied on moral exposure. Peaceful resistance created images that shocked the conscience of the world. Beatings without retaliation, arrests without rebellion, suffering that could not be framed as criminal. This worked because the British Empire still cared about reputation, public opinion, and historical legitimacy. Shame was possible. Pressure mattered. Stoicism immediately raises a red flag here. What happens when shame disappears? What happens when the opponent does not seek legitimacy, fears no judgment, and answers moral appeal with extermination? The Stoics lived under emperors who ruled by terror. They understood power stripped of conscience. Marcus Aurelius ruled armies, not moral audiences. He never assumed that virtue alone would disarm brutality. He believed that reason must sometimes coexist with force in order to preserve justice and protect the innocent. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Reason demands that we act for the common good, even when the world resists us." Gandhi's refusal to employ force under any circumstance introduces a dangerous dependency. His method assumes an enemy capable of moral reflection. When that assumption fails, nonviolence risks becoming helplessness. This is not theoretical. Gandhi himself was confronted with this dilemma during the rise of Nazi Germany. His response shocked many. He suggested that collective nonviolent sacrifice might awaken the conscience of the world. From a Stoic perspective, this conclusion is deeply troubling. Stoicism is not pacifism. It recognizes self-defense as a duty. The protection of family, community, and the innocent may require force when all other options collapse. Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, argued that justice exists to preserve order and harmony within society, not to enable its destruction. Zeno taught, "The purpose of justice is the preservation of the community." Cicero, heavily influenced by Stoic ethics, articulated the foundation of just resistance. Violence, while tragic, can become necessary when it prevents greater injustice. Cicero argued, "Wars are to be undertaken so that we may live in peace without injustice." Modern critics of absolute non-violence echo this concern. Christopher Hitchens argued that non-violence is not a universal moral law, but a context-dependent strategy. Its success depends on the moral limitations of the opponent. Against absolute evil, it may collapse entirely. From a Stoic lens, this is the decisive fracture. Stoicism prepares the individual for any world, peaceful or brutal, just or corrupt. Gandhi's method shines under specific conditions, but falters when confronted by regimes immune to moral pressure. This does not erase Gandhi's achievements, it clarifies their limits. His philosophy was powerful, but not universally applicable. Stoicism does not promise moral beauty alone. It demands preparedness for reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. In this chapter, the court delivers no condemnation, only clarity. Non-violence can be heroic, it can be transformative. But when faced with absolute tyranny, Stoicism insists on a harsher truth. Virtue without the capacity to protect life may become a tragic ideal rather than a functional ethic. Number 7, the Stoic verdict. A saint of action, not a sage of reason. The Stoic court withdraws to deliberate. What stands before it is not a simple figure, but a complex moral force. Gandhi enters this judgment with extraordinary credentials: radical self-discipline, emotional sovereignty, moral courage under sustained pressure. Few individuals in modern history displayed such consistency between belief and action. By Stoic standards, this alone places him far above the average moral actor. Yet Stoicism does not judge by admiration, it judges by alignment. The defense has shown that Gandhi mastered temperance to an almost inhuman degree. He conquered fear, desire, comfort, and ego. He maintained inner order while the external world collapsed around him. In this sense, he lived many Stoic virtues more rigorously than those who merely studied them. The prosecution, however, revealed decisive fractures. Gandhi's engine was not reason alone, it was love. His resistance was animated by compassion, faith, and emotional identification with both victim and oppressor. Stoicism remains wary here. Emotional attachment, even noble, introduces instability. A Stoic acts justly because reason demands it, not because the heart compels it. There is also the matter of ends. Gandhi's life was oriented toward a historical outcome: national liberation, political transformation, collective redemption. Stoicism refuses this dependency. For the Stoic, the action itself is the success. History's response is irrelevant. Gandhi's suffering gained meaning through change. Stoic suffering gains meaning through integrity alone. Chrysippus drew a clear line between virtue and consequence. Chrysippus taught, "Virtue is complete in itself, regardless of what follows." This is where Gandhi ultimately diverges. His philosophy was not designed to be indifferent to outcomes. It was designed to reshape them. And finally, there is the question Stoicism cannot ignore: universality. Gandhi's method depends on an opponent capable of moral shame. Stoicism prepares for a world where shame may be absent, where violence answers virtue, and where defense becomes a duty rather than a failure. So was Gandhi a Stoic? The answer by Stoic standards is no. But this is not a dismissal, it is a distinction. Gandhi was not a sage of reason in the Stoic sense. He was something else entirely, a saint of action, a man who fused spiritual conviction with political struggle and accepted suffering as a form of persuasion. His system was not built for every world, but for a specific kind of world. And in that world, it changed history. Stoicism seeks inner freedom regardless of circumstances. Gandhi sought moral transformation through visible sacrifice, different paths, different engines, a shared destination of integrity, but reached by radically different means. The verdict is not condemnation or absolution, it is recognition. Gandhi does not belong to the Stoic tradition, but his life proves that virtue can emerge from many philosophies. Wisdom is not owned by any single school. It is discovered wherever a human being refuses to betray conscience under pressure. Gandhi's life forces us to confront a question most people avoid. What does it truly cost to live by a principle when the world pushes back? His story proves that strength does not always appear as domination or force. Sometimes strength looks like restraint, sometimes it looks like endurance, and sometimes it looks like a man willing to suffer publicly so that injustice can no longer hide behind excuses. From a Stoic perspective, Gandhi was not a master of reason in the classical sense. He did not build his life around emotional independence or outcome indifference, yet he embodied something equally rare: moral consistency at an extreme level. His discipline was real, his courage was undeniable, and his refusal to betray his conscience reshaped history. Stoicism reminds us that virtue must stand even when the world refuses to change. Gandhi reminds us that visible sacrifice can sometimes force the world to look at itself. This is the deeper lesson. There is no single path to integrity. Some walk it through reason, others through faith, some by mastering emotion, others by embracing compassion as a weapon. What matters is not the label of the philosophy, but the willingness to pay the price of alignment between belief and action. Now I want to hear from you. Which part of this judgment challenged you the most? Gandhi's discipline, his emotional control, his refusal to retaliate, or the limits of non-violence when faced with absolute evil? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thoughtful disagreement sharpens understanding. If this analysis brought clarity, take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who values principle over impulse. And subscribe to the channel if you want to keep exploring how ancient wisdom judges modern power, ambition, and influence. In the next video, we will examine a modern figure who reshaped industries, challenged governments, dominated headlines, and polarized public opinion. A man celebrated as a visionary by some and condemned as reckless by others. We will place ambition, ego, control, and responsibility under the Stoic lens and ask a question few are willing to confront. When does innovation serve virtue, and when does it begin to serve the self? To close, remember this: conviction is useless unless it is lived, and living it always has a cost. See you in the next video.